Good evening, Mirama. Welcome to the nice program. This is the second week of Summer School at School, the first evening of the public program this week. I'm very happy that we have tonight with us Martin Fritz in discussion with Daniel Cosentino. Martin is back since quite some time. He was with us in one of the early editions of Summer School at School when we had just started this exploration, basically. So it's interesting to have him back, also, and to have his lecture tonight. I'm going to read briefly something from the material that is also available in the space. So the title of the lecture is Institutional Critique and Institutional Practice. The abstract sounds like this. Artists are bound to the institutions in their field by an ambivalent relationship. They are more aware that they have ever been of how their work is involved with the institutional framework of its presentation. At the intersection between the premises of institutional critique, which has developed step by step into comprehensive method of artistic social contextualization, and the different manifestation of site-specific art, numerous examples of works are to be found that adapt a close architectural, social, structural, and processual relationship with institutions of their presentation. The starting point of the lecture is the assertion that there is a symbiotic-constructive relationship between production and institution, and that this takes shape as ideal, appropriation, co-creation, critique, and rejection. There's more in the text that you can find in the space, as I said. Martin Fritz has studied law in Vienna from 1981 to 1986. Since then, he has worked in the field of contemporary art production in Vienna, New York, Germany, and other countries. Starting with independent projects in theater, visual arts, and film in the 1980s, he has specialized in producing and conceiving visual art projects in collaboration with the curators and institutions, with a special emphasis on project management and art production in the public space. Among other assignments, he has worked as Director of Operations for the reopening of P.A.I.N, Contemporary Art Center in New York, General Coordinator of Manifesta 4, European Biennial of Contemporary Art in Frankfurt, and Managing Director of In Between, the art project of Expo 2000 Hanover. Recently, he has worked as a consultant on structural and organizational issues for art funding initiatives such as Relations, a project initiated by the German Cultural Foundation in Berlin and Astor Foundation in Vienna. His scriptural work includes art projects for the hospital in Merano, Italy, and art projects for the University of Klagenfurt, Austria, among others. Just briefly read something about Daniel, which accepted this invitation to discuss with you tonight. Daniel Cosentino is a multimedia artist and educator specialized in photographic process and discourses. He holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in philosophy from Rogers University and a Master of Fine Arts in Imaging Arts Photography from the Rochester Institute of Technology, RIT. Between 1998 and 2001, Cosentino lived and worked in the Mountain States region of the USA, working in a custom photo lab in Jackson, Wyoming. He also developed his first public exhibitions. What is important, especially for this case, is that from 2008 to 2010, he served as a joint professor at IT College in Art and Design and at the University of RIT. Since September 2010, he has been based in Pristina as an assistant professor at IRT Kosovo, formerly the American University in Kosovo. He was teaching primarily photography, graphic design, web design. Besides teaching, he has experience of academic leadership as a vice president for academic affairs and director of IT programs in Kosovo for 3 consecutive years, from 2015 to 2018, where he also served as a chair for academic senate and director of media programs. Further, I took more time. The floor is yours. Thank you so much again, Martin.
Thank you so much. It's really such a pleasure to be back here after 2015 and 2016 and to see how Summer School at School is this permanent picture of not only the local but the say, regional in the wider sense, as I always felt it has a sense of region ranging from London to Istanbul in scope and in intellectual and practical reach. So thank you very much for inviting me back, Albert. Thanks a lot to, and I need to read her last name. Thank you very much to Aida Recepagic, who took wonderful care of all the practical necessities of travel and accommodation and technical support which was given to me just before your colleague, whose name I was not able to write down. Thank you very much. So, first, compliance report is that this might not be a lecture as you could expect if you read a lecture. This is more what I usually do to start workshops which are devoted to making people think about how they, as artists, as curators, as cultural workers in the broadest sense, would like institutions to be. So the idea that we could do within the next, in that evening, is that we jointly think about how we want institutions to be. So it's not so much about me telling you what in various times artists develop as models, but it's more supposed to confront you with a certain variety of approaches by artists to the institution of art. To go one step further, which is more interesting, to say, okay, how would something new look like that we are about to found, that we are about to collaborate with, or that we are confronted with as happening in our immediate environments as a cultural policy initiative or as a proposal, fictitious or realistic proposals such the ones that have been done, for example, in the context of mentalist. So, and this is why it's also a little bit like a historical grounding of those questions. I'm glad that I have seen that Laura Rekovic presented here, and for those who have been here, I'm sure that she confronted you with a lot of examples of current controversies around museums. Probably she was talking about the Whitney Museum's controversy, probably she was talking about her experiences at the Queen's Museum. So I'm very glad, because knowing that Laura Rekovic was in the room, in the same room, allows me to maybe narrow the presentation to one example that we will look at a little bit more closely, which is the example of the Art Workers Coalition's activities in 1969 in New York. But before we do that, just a few slides by way of personal, professional introduction so that you know what's the perspective that I can represent. And this is not a theoretical perspective. This is also not a, I could say, fully fledged academic art historical perspective, because as Albert pointed out in his introduction, my education was in law. And with this background in law, I very quickly, because of personal friendships and biographical reasons, I started to work in arts. So to cut a long story short, I was always responsible in art circles for money, for permissions, for budgets, for contracts, for general questions of organization, for setting up NGOs, for setting up new institutions. And through that specialization, I developed this kind of expertise on what can be called institutional studies, or what can be called contextual research, or what as an art practice is called institutional critique. So what you see here is one of the first activities I was working on, which was an exhibition by then 20 young artists in one of the public parks of Vienna in Volksgarten, and I showed that in the beginning, because whatever I did after, basically self-organized practices, independently organized, artist-driven activities have been, let's say, at the core of my priorities ever since. So the potential be it public space, be it vacant buildings like here, be it other contexts, to use those contexts for independently self-organized production is one thing that I want to point out right away. I observe some discussions. Is there a technical problem that I should be aware of? So you see that as basically a signifier for the importance of independent production and for the importance of artist-driven activities for what we are about, what we are to talk about. And you see here, for example, it's just one of the examples by then and now unknown Austrian artist, Franz Pichler, a good Austrian artist, if I may say so. That, of course, producing art in whatever context does not happen in a vacuum. So, if you look at a work like this modeling of a copy of a traditional sculpture involves questions of permissions, it involves questions of, ideological, discussion around why the work is done in the first place. It involves permissions and so forth. And it was always my position to mediate between the authorities and the artists to make production like this possible. I'll do a quick step. In reality, there are 10 years in between to show you that then also I was able to work in what is considered quite established institutions, but with it's an important difference. I was involved with P.A.I.N when it reopened after a 4-year renovation phase, which was basically the equivalent of founding it new again. So it was a very rare opportunity to reopen one of the centers of independent art space, some people call it the mother of alternative art spaces, about 20 years after it was originally opened. And of course, reopening a structure like P.A.I.N, this was before its joint venture with MoMA, and most likely our reopening success had something to do with becoming, let's say, qualified for MoMA in that sense. But reopening means having to think about what an institution should be. What kind of institution should it be in the future? Should it have, should there be admission? Should there not be admission? What should be its name in the first place? Just to decide on whether you call something Institute for Contemporary Art, as it was called before the reopening, then changing its name to P.A.I.N Contemporary Art Center, is something that involves work, and that was part of the work that I was used to doing. Again, the importance of the artist's perspective and the artist's activity is just, exemplified by this image where you see, unfortunately, 3 of these artists have already died recently: John Baldessari, Richard Nonas, and Lawrence Wiener. So it's really like a memorial to their work. But, if you work on projects like these, you also find out that, artists fight among themselves. So we have the artists here, now that they are unfortunately gone, one can talk about it, who basically had different opinions about how their colleagues Richard Nonas' work should look. It originally had horizontal beams, which the other artists thought were blocking the view of their work, and then there was controversies around it, but they were settled by the artists themselves. So what I wanted to say by way of introduction is that my personal experience in managing, producing, and organizing art projects I was always exposed to seeing that artists, by way of their critique, by way of their demands, by way of their interaction with the structure, with the host, with the institution, basically shape it in a big sense. So be it in Volksgarten with young artists who will ask you whether you say there's a budget of, I don't know, 20 euro, and they ask you whether they can have 50, or why it's unfair that one person can spend 20 and the other person can spend 50. This is where it starts, and all these discussions basically remain the same even then, if you work in bigger and more established structures like manifestors or documenters, who I did not work myself, but my wife did. And so I had some quite good insights in the realities about production, and one of the takeaways was that artists try to underestimate their importance and try to underestimate their influence on the way the artist works. So when this presentation emphasizes this kind of dialectical symbiosis between artists and its institutions, it's also because I have seen it at work. So you see how museum curators would think they do it one way, then they will confront an artist with their plans, then the artist will object, then they will change their plans. I have seen how institutions react when they're being criticized by artists from the outside, and believe me, nothing is more keenly observed on a director's level in institutions than critique. So you can assume every critical word is written and is read by people running institutions. It's not like they're not aware. So the relationship between institutions and other actors in the field, maybe artists, freelance persons, freelance art workers, is much more reciprocal than people might think if they only look at it as some kind of inside the fortress, outside the fortress relationship. So there's this one image that people would feel like, oh, I'm outside and they're inside, and the only way to communicate is basically to fight. But many of the realities of the art world are different. It's much more permeable. People find themselves inside and outside at the same time. People move from outside to inside. People are being criticized from outside and then they react. So this is why when in 2011, and this is just one thing that you know very well, I worked for Manifesta. I was general coordinator in Frankfurt, and I was on the board of Manifesta 4 or 5 years later, including one of the most threatening moments in Manifesta's history, namely the cancellation of Manifesta 6 in Nicosia for reasons of local politics, which I'm still not allowed to fully comment on in public. So you see, from cancellation to minor changes in budgets, everything is possible because people pursue an agenda, pursue an artistic agenda, pursue a political agenda, and start to get in contact with each other. And this is the basis of what I can talk to you about. So you cannot expect, and Leska is here, an eminent theoretician that you all should come to here tomorrow. So you cannot expect all the footnotes that eminent theorists are able to give. But you can expect, practical experiences from somebody like me. Now, returning to the title, and now you know a little bit about my background. Of course, I was always interested in how institutions work, and that's why I choose this image as the title, which is basically a toy set that you can buy at Vienna's Secessions shop. It's a postcard based. It's like an architectural model where you can take Secession's elements and put it together. But of course, in that way, you can only put it together correctly. So it doesn't give you full freedom to reassemble it, but still I thought it's a telling image for that institutions can be taken apart, can be analyzed, can be looked at, and can be reconfigured. Now, institutional critique and institutional practice is, let's say, in my experience, both sides, like artists and people in institutions, sometimes working on the same objectives. So the interesting thing is, and I will just show you 3 examples of the, let's say, classical period of institutional critique in the early 70s, where the interest in institutional structures, the interest in contextual questions, historically maybe developed out of notions like site specificity, so taking into account when you produce art, to take the context, the site into account, which of course can be expanded from purely architectural to sociological, legal, and political contexts that you work in. And you see, for example, one of the canonical works by Lederman and Euclid in 1973, she basically took the keys, or she was allowed as a performance, she was able to took all the keys from the guards for one morning for her performance, made as security at the Wordsworth Athenaeum, a very prestigious exhibition space. So what Lederman did as an act of empowering, and I would say not only empowering the artists, but also empowering the woman, given that having keys is like a classical symbol of what lawyers call the right to the house. So if you have the right to the house, you have the keys. And she took the keys and then spent the morning opening and closing museum doors, department doors, rooms, galleries, so to show that artists should have more influence or claim more of a say in the operations of an institution. This is just one example. Another one, and if you only, for those of you who are not so familiar with these developments, if you only write down one name, then write down Michael Asher's name. For his artwork, for his writing, for his teaching, for everything he did, he's probably the most influential artist in this field in the late 20th century. And what you see, this is usually a test at the beginning of a workshop, and so I usually ask, what is the artwork that you look at? Where is the art? And then people start to speculate what it could be, maybe the lights, maybe the canvases in the back. But I tell you, no, it's that the wall behind the gallery, between the gallery and the office, was removed. So a very simple but very, very influential gesture. He was invited to show his work in a commercial gallery, and he removed the wall between the gallery white cube and the office area with the desks where the dealing takes place. So with that intervention, Mike Asher basically introduced this kind of centerpiece of contextual art practices to look behind the walls, to see what's behind the walls of institutions, to make transparent what's usually or very often hidden away, to not be for it not to be discussed. And if you look at, just to put a little groundwork to the lecture, if you look at these, influential early works of institutional critique, of course we also want to look at Hans Haacke. And what Hans Haacke did here in 1974 looks very generic today, actually, and you can actually today find it in many reports, but it was something special then. Hans Haacke basically took the names of the trustees of the Guggenheim Museum in New York and added their corporate affiliations. So he took the list, which usually just shows the names of a museum board, and a board in the American non-profit organization, not only in American, but in most non-profit organizations, is the top responsible governing body. So the people who actually run the show, in a legal sense, are the trustees. And so Hans Haacke publicized their corporate affiliations, their business interests. So Haacke, in a gallery exhibition, as his artwork, published a list of names and what they did as part of their business. And works like these were among the reasons why I realized, between the methods of institutional critique and my own work, there is something which joins it together. So I realized institutional critique is not only something that artists can do, because for somebody having studied law, this is a very standard procedure. You know that there are public registers, you know that you can look up the governing structures of businesses, you know that there are public records that you can consult. And then I thought, well, I can be as interested in the workings of the art field and art institutions as all these famous artists. And that's why this title, Institutional Critique and Institutional Practice, relates to what I have done. So I've seen and observed a lot of artists pursuing these practices, and these practices have become, let's say, a repertoire of contemporary art, at least for the last 50 years. So it's not unusual any longer for artists to investigate the institutional structures. And at the same time, that's maybe the core of what I want to discuss with you. At the same time, institutions have adopted and have reacted to the strategies of institutional critiques, so that at one point you could theoretically also talk about joint work. So in 2011 I did an exhibition which was on the relationship of artists and institutions, or art and institutions. And I call it Beziehungsarbeit, and in English that's working on relationships. And so the idea was that the relationship between artists and institutions, you could also compare it somehow to love relationships, or to couples. You know, this notion of Beziehungsarbeit means work. You know, so both sides work in their relationship to make it happen. And you know this what sometimes happens when people are together, then they always have this tendency to wanting to improve the other person. So they want to say like, oh, I love you, but I would love you even more if you were, I don't know, if you were, more fun or more sportive, or if you dress differently. So you have this kind of drama of the relationship is one side trying to improve the other. And this is why I thought this title could work as a title on the relationship of artists and institutions. And one proof, if you want, for example, is this quote from Tate Modern's website some years ago. That, for example, in the course of the last 20, 30 years, it became standard practice for at least, transparent institutions to publish the business interests and to publish the background of their trustees. So the then chairman of the trustees of Tate, he himself publishes that he served as the chief executive of British Petroleum, among other interests, and he was also obliged by Tate, by the statutes of and British law, that those business interests of people in trustee and board positions in NGOs need to be made public. So here, for example, we have one example of activist artwork of institutional critique by Hanke in 1974 being a standard institutional practice in the 2000s in one of the leading galleries or museums for contemporary art in Great Britain. It's not that I say Hanke forced Tate to do that, but it's that I say various actors at the same time had similar interests to make institutions more transparent, to make both institutions more accountable. Here again, this is just one more element of this list. But of course, also the heritage of critiquing the institution, of working against the institution and critiquing it, is then based on this transparency. So what you see here are activists of the artist activist group Liberate Tate, which campaigned for years in the 12 to 19, continuously campaigned against British Petroleum. Remember, the chairman of the board was once the chairman of British Petroleum. At the same time, British Petroleum had a long-standing sponsorship relationship with Tate, but groups like Liberate Tate campaigned against these sponsorship and finally succeeded with Tate, or vice versa, British Petroleum ending its sponsorship agreement with British Petroleum. So here, it somehow comes full circle. You have an artistic strategy in the 70s, you have an institutional reality in the 2010s, you have the activist practice having learned from institutional critique that you can intervene, that there is an activist influence on museum operations, which made this change in the museum strategy happen. If you look at Tate's website today, you will find a new chairman with no business affiliations in those industries that were criticized lately. So just take a moment to read that, because Andrea Fraser, another one of these highly influential artists of institutional critique, and there's not time enough today to credit her work, but it's widely and well published, so just the name alone is enough for you to really get access to a lot of her work and information. And you see what she writes, and she writes, and partly by having written that inspires what I tell you, that there is a constructive relationship of institutional critique to the institutions it critiques. So she writes, and I fully agree, anyone familiar with his work, and I would say with many other artists working in institutional critique's work, Hake's project has been an attempt to defend the institution of art from instrumentalization by political and economic interests. So it's actually wanting a better museum. It's wanting a more independent institution. It's wanting a more devoted institution. That's the drive behind a lot of this criticism. Not so much the desire to abolish it, not so much this kind of punk attitude of let's throw some bombs in the museum and just get rid of it. So it's not so much about a revolutionary drive to abolish something which is considered old and not needed. It's more this kind of evolutionary energy to trying to improve improve the institution. Now we'll look at one example a little bit more closely, and then in the last 10 minutes we'll just look at what that could mean for our discussion. One of the famous examples, and if you want inspiration on demands, you can always go back to 1969 and the Art Workers Coalition in New York. Missing link is Franz Hake was also part of the Art Workers Coalition. It started with one artist removing his work from an exhibition, a work that was actually owned by MoMA, Museum of Modern Art in New York, but the artist was not satisfied with the way it was presented. So it started as a very, let's say, traditional intervention of an artist saying, look, I'm not happy with my presentation. I just take my work out personally because you did not ask me, because you own my work. So the museum owned his work and thought it would just install it without consulting the artist again. Takis was not happy with it. Takis removed it. But following this intervention, and at the same time, and that's interesting for further research because actually I have not paid so much attention until maybe a few months ago, that at the same time, another protest was going on in New York, and this was the protest of mainly African American and black artists against an exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which was called Harlem on My Mind, where this activist group demanded that the exhibition immediately be closed. And you look at the demands, you can see with 1, 2, 3, and those artists asked from the Metropolitan Museum the immediate cancellation of the Harlem on My Mind show, Second point, that the Metropolitan Museum appoints blacks to policy-making and curatorial positions. And 3, that the Metropolitan Museum seek a more viable relationship with the total black community. So you have 2 protests basically at the same time, January, February '69 in New York, directed against the Metropolitan Museum, directed against the Museum of Modern Art, with one artist being part of both activities. And out of these conflicts, a larger group developed, probably 60 to 100 people, depending on the meetings. They met over the course of a month. They started plenary sessions to develop their agenda and to develop their demands. I invite all of us now, it's a total of about 13 demands, to look at those demands, because surprisingly, up to today, this is one of the very few examples where artists' written demands to an institution include very practical institutional questions and wider political questions, ecological questions, questions of how it was called then minority representation. So up to today, this is one of the, let's say, broadest statement of demands, and that way it also helps to start our discussions among us, what would be our demands today in this field. So you see the radicality probably already see in the first paragraph. They want power. So they say the Board of Trustees should be made up of 1/3 museum staff, 1/3 patrons, 1/3 artists. A basically unheard of composition up to today. So you see, if you really take it seriously, if you really want to engage in a controversy or a discussion on institutional structures, you also need to look at their governance structure. That's what they do right in the first paragraph, asking for representation. Second paragraph, a very classical demand for free admission, but informed by a clear political agenda, so that they plus evening openings to accommodate working people. Number 3, and think about all the discussions we've heard and been part of, that we at least were able to observe in the last years, with Black Lives Matter, with a lot of these valuable impulses that we all owe to these initiatives. But look back, this is 56 years old. So if you look at number 3, in the language of its time, the museum should centralize their activities and the Black Puerto Rican and all other communities. They should support events, and they should even branch out into other parts of the city. Now that we want to talk about urban planning and art as one of the possible subjects. So even the Art Workers Coalition in 1969 talks about decentralization and into relatively cheap, flexible branch museums or cultural centers that could not carry the stigma of catering only to the welfare sections of society. Keep in mind for the discussion later on what you miss. Think about what you want to on a list like that. That's important. So if we had more than an evening, that would keep us busy for a full week, to develop our own statement out of that. Here again, number 4, questions of representation and anti-discrimination. Number 5, gender justice. Number 6, the question of how do museums relate to what's there in their cities, the wealth of artistic practices. Are they also supposed to keep files, archive, document artistic practices? That was very much one of the valuable things that the Centers for Contemporary Art of the Source Foundation then, later Susanna will remember, did in their respective contexts to provide information on local artists. And then please note number 7. And number 7 is very important because number 7 is really surprising, and every time I read that, every 2 years I find new things in the same 13 demands. It's really crazy. So if you look at number 7, our book's collision says museum staff should take positions and use their political influence in matters concerning the welfare of artists. Okay, we know that, that's classical. Artists want to have better material conditions. Artist housing, rent control, legislations for artist rights. And then, in particular, museums should be aroused by the crisis threatening man's survival and should make their own demands to the government that ecological problems be put on a par with war and space efforts. So we look at a statement which is 56 years old, and we look at the demand that also museums should be an active voice in a broader political struggle, in a broader struggle for survival, which is linked to the ecological crisis and compared with the efforts that go into war efforts. So just to give you an idea, that's why I think the statement is always worth to present it again. I would say the weakness of a lot of artistic political activity, if I may be critical of some of the artists at least, is that very often it's only about their own thing. Artist fees, better copyright, rent, cheaper rents, but only for artists, more money, but only for artists. So a lot of things are only for artists. But here you see a statement where people obviously have an agenda which goes beyond their own special interests and really opens up the discourse to a wider political spectrum. So here you again have demands for representation of artists not represented by commercial galleries, artist rights demands. Forgive this, there was a mistake in copying the file, so you just ignore that navigation in there. And then, in the last section B, they also introduce material demands, demands for better payment, demands for artist fee. But what I like very much is the first sentence. They write, until such time as a minimum income is guaranteed for all people. The economic position of artists should be improved in the following ways, and then they list what they think should be done. So again, and I think that's also important, I think we saw in the last decade, we saw a development from, let's say, the artistic institutional critique, or maybe site specificity, institutional critique, relational aesthetics, social practices, social activism, political activism. And now I think we're at a moment in time, right now, where it's clear that you have to integrate any artistically critical agenda, you have to embed it in a wider political analysis. And that's why I like, for example, this example of saying, until such time as a minimum income is guaranteed for all people, that, shows that you are aware that it's not only about art and its institutions, but they're part of a broader context of the society. So I'll have to cut that short, but this is also, by way of recommendation, go into files. It's a very well documented history. There's a lot of material available online on the art workers collection. But what's also very interesting, of course, and I cut that short, that's the facsimile of the letter they received very early on in the process. And I especially like the last paragraph, and that again relates to tonight's topic. The executive director of MoMA writes back to those artists, we think that you and your colleagues have performed a useful and timely service in entering into discussions with us. So you see, the reaction is not immediate closing doors, fighting back, ignoring them, but the reaction of a professional museum director, even in '69, is, thank you very much for your service, it's very good, we really look forward to discussing with you, we are aware that you're there, and we appreciate your criticism. And then, step by step, of course, not many of their demands have been met. But, traditionally, for a larger part of the next 50 years, admission to MoMA was actually free. So, it's now they reconsider those policies again, but that it was free for a long time was one of the results of the Art Workers Coalition's activities. So keep in mind that there's always a chance of somebody writing back, oh, thank you very much, why don't we meet in 2 weeks and go and continue our discussion. So this is very much part of the relationship of the critical art sector to its institutions, that this is theoretically, answers like that are theoretically possible. But of course you can also, you should read this short section of Lucy Lippert's account. Lucy Lippert, who was part of the Art Workers Coalition, wrote an account of its activities, which I forgot to put the credit underneath it. So it's Lucy Lippert, the Art Workers Coalition. You can find it also easily online. And I think some of you here, and I specifically think about Colette as far as I know, but your practice and others would look at the first paragraph saying the most controversial aspect of the AWC among artists and establishment has been its so-called politicization of art. The term usually used to cover the black and women programs as well as demands that museums speak out against racism, war, and repression. So the question whether or not the political should be part of the artistic, can be part of the artistic, was of course part of discussion in that group. So we close that section on the Art Workers Coalition with Lucy Lippert's account and make a quick jump, which would then, very directly lead us into the discussion, maybe even about Christina today. I observed that there was a change maybe happening in the last 10, 15 years that what was purely critical of younger generations of artists, confronting the institutions, attacking the institutions, turned into an interest in founding institutions themselves. So institutionalize, instituting yourself. So not only hoping that you could confront the important institution, but realizing, so what do we do when MoMA does not call? What do we do if they just do not care about us? And then, of course, we talk about the founding of off spaces, founding of alternative institutions, founding again of self-organized practices. And this is what we want to devote the last 5 minutes to. So here, to open up the space of thoughts, basically you look at a historical example again from the 70s by Wolf Fostel for a drive-by museum. So just to make us aware again that if artists and people in arts should or want to think about new institutions, there should be space for really new things. Because if you look at these gigantic TVs on a highway crossing, of course that's not a realistic proposal for a museum, but it opens up space for what a museum or art institutions can be. A similar open-ended strategy was used by Jun Yang. Jun Yang is a Chinese, Austrian-Chinese artist living in Taipei and in Tokyo and Vienna. And he was invited to participate in the Taipei Biennial in 2008. And he turned his participation in the biennial into a campaign. So he basically published those posters with, saying that Taipei needs a contemporary art center and asking his audience what it should look like, what it should be. So he, as a younger artist, I would say, integrated his demands, not in a traditional confrontational critical way, but in a moment where he said, okay, we can be part of that. A contemporary art center is missing in the city. We want to use the dynamics around the biennial to open up that conversation. And he was lucky, he did it at the right time. So his activities with other people actually led to the foundation of the Taipei Contemporary Art Center, which was opened about 2 years after the biennial. I have to say that since it ran then for approximately 8 to 10 years, it's again now closed, but it was a success. And then when they opened, and that leads us back to notions of transparency, money, political influence, and so forth. One of the important things that they started with right away was to be very transparent about their operations. So again, an artist used a strategy that you could also use, I would say, in political campaigning. The artist with other people, non-artists, curators, cultural workers, establishes a contemporary art center. And one thing they do is to establish the transparency that people like Hake in the 60s and 70s had to force from museums or from institutions to really be honest about the source of their support and of the money and their influences. And now you see why I told you all that, because here we are. So, you see, I mean, there were demands in the past for new institutions. There was an example, and it's just one of the many examples of artists, of cultural producers imagining new institutions. Here you are with biennial in your city, with Manifesto in your city, and surprise, surprise, it actually already established in new institutions. And, you know, people like me, of course, what do we look at? We look at, you know, financing structures, we want to know how things are developed. I look forward to discussing where these ideas come from or came from in the first place. But of course, you know, if you look at a label like that, it tells you something about the current state of affairs, of cultural policy, that obviously an initiative like that, you know, needs quite considerable donations from foreign countries to be brought into being. And of course, knowing that it's just next door, people like me who knew Boxing Club, for example, since 2015, would probably think, oh, yeah, well, why is this now brand new and beautiful and not here? So these are things that, of course, are much closer to your reality and your discourse than my theory. And, you know, and then you look at things like this little mirror, which is part of the brick factory operation, which basically provides a very small, simple outlet for the expression of wishes. So it asks, basically, this place could be. So what could that place be? And that brick factory. I don't show that as an example of a super invitation for participation. Of course not. It's just a symbol. You know, it's a symbol how you produce a wish, how you produce an image, how you start a process. And sometimes you start a process by just asking, well, what do you want? What do you need? What is your idea for a new institution? And immediately you see that, of course, in the public realm, you're not alone. So it's not like everybody wants an art institution. Obviously, people talk about a hostel. Some people talk about public green. Some just write agora, whatever an agora could be in a situation like that. Some write about an architectural office. Some just say space. Some say a pool. So within the broader political spectrum, of course, art institutions are not the only missing thing. In places like Pristina, probably other things are also missing. Maybe other things are missed more dearly. I don't know. You know. So with that image, we'll basically, you know, start the discussion among us. And I just go back to my personal introduction to show you what's at stake sometime. This is very, you know, simple by comparison, but it's just one little detail of that things do not only go one way. So this is what this place where we did our exhibition looked like in 1988. You look at all the people sitting at the steps and all the chairs. And this is what it looks like after it became a real thing. You know, after the Museum of Cosentino Museum of Art History in Vienna officially took over the structure. Now there's the chains, now it's renovated. Now, of course, there's strict regulations on how you can use it or how you cannot use it. So when we talk about these processes in a historical timeline, It's not that the development always goes from closed to open, from untransparent to transparent, from worse to better. They can also go, in different ways, and that's, I think, what we can discuss, or if you want to, be happy to join this discussion among you right now. Thank you very much.
Let's start with this. In a broader context, just because we're going to be talking about a lot of cultures here, what can represent an institution? What is an institution? So I'll give you two kind of things. An institution can be an institute of art, like a MoMA, that represents modern art, preserving collections, presenting a certain kind of art to the public. An institution could also be marriage within a society. When you think of that as an institution, that's something that's agreed on. So what are some of your thoughts about how we can expansively think about what institutions are and how they intersect?
Well, as I said, what I do is what I like to call practice-based practice, so I'll just talk from what I know. The classical distinction would be between the project and the institution. So you would say the project as being something temporal, something having a beginning and an end, as opposed to the institution with a longer life, with a sense of continuity, with a certain procedure to found it, to close it, like an NGO. You set it up, and once it's set up, there's a certain ritual of renewal every year. We talked about marriage. Couples have their rituals. Some even marry again. So I would introduce that probably for what we need to discuss. I want to emphasize continuity as a factor, because art and its activities is so full of project and one-offs and ad hoc activities that I think if we want to distinguish institutions, we could look at how do we make our practice, or can we develop continuity in practices.
And the continuity there would be like stronger foundational establishments, greater social memory. Would that relate to the importance of the culture, or the strength in the culture, whether it can preserve that institutional longevity?
No, it's more, let's say, at least my emphasis is more that you can start them anew. So for me, it's not about looking back at the great history of institutions and thinking about how can we preserve that great continuity. For me, it's more how can we add our own institutions to this continuity. Because, the exhibition I did in Vienna, I was invited to do that for the 150th anniversary of this artist institution. So this artist club, Kunsthaus, was around for 150 years.
Long time.
Yes, but what's even more interesting for me is what could we start tomorrow that will have its 150th anniversary in 2172, maybe here. So this is, I think, why continuity is an interesting aspect, because we're all used to these things that are around for a long time, at least especially in Austria, but in a context like here, it's really as urgent, I think, to think about, okay, what's next?
Prior to this talk, we exchanged a few emails, and you sent me about the Kunsthaus and about this exhibition, and inside of that there was a conversation with Nina Schermeyer, and in it, I found a few quotes in it that I thought might be interesting for this crowd. She says, I hope, you say, I hope that this exhibition also tells the story of how social institutions, again, I sometimes think of, there's the institution that's that's a physical space, and it's so important to establish a physical space, and we'll get to that in what's been proposed here for years in developing a new contemporary art institute for Pristina, something that was locally or social institutions can be, and of the kinds of dialogue and transparency they must stand for. The dialogue and transparency that the social institutions stand for. And she says, are the institutions really so endangered? New museums are opening all the time. And we can add now, and I'll make another point on this, now we're in the digital age. All sorts of new kinds of museums open, and all sorts of new kinds of access to those museums open as collections go online, dialogues happen online, and you don't have to make a physical space always for the institution to flourish. And you say, but the reality today is that there are only a few art spaces that take on social roles like producing knowledge. So I wanted you to talk a little bit more about, in your experience in the institutions, what are the kinds that are producing knowledge, and what are the kinds that are kind of preserving history, perhaps? And what has more value? Is there in a place like Kosovo, is it more important to establish things that produce knowledge?
Well, first, I had a chance to be here for summer school. I was even once here on a kind of a research mission for the Austrian Institute of Culture. I'm somewhat informed about the context, but by no way an expert, and I want to be careful because the history of a country which was at war, which had a much more dramatic and also traumatizing history. It's not something you should really comment on too light-footedly, as we say. So bear that in mind. But of course I remember when I was here first in 2002, everything was heritage. Heritage. So you only heard about heritage as a hope, as it seemed then, to somehow strengthen your position culturally and politically. So that this was kind of seemed to be the bigger concern then of at least some of the people we met as part of some kind of capacity building activity, as it was called then. And of course, against this idea that only heritage can create stability and identity and whatever, I propose that actual social relations of people to one another, to discussing the future of their country, of their society, of their institutions, of their art scene, the better path. At least it's the path that I know more about. So I'm just not very knowledgeable about working with the past. I'm more knowledgeable about what do people like what could we do now to develop things that maybe in 20, 30, 40, 50 years then slowly become something like a heritage or whatever. Is that
in some sense, that institution would be starting from the now and producing new knowledge, producing contemporary exposures for the scene to develop in.
Yeah, it would definitely
preservation.
It would definitely create a space where a new way of being together would work, where the program, as you could say, is not so defined by, for example, a collection. So where a program is not defined by the care you need to provide to, have 1,000 mummies survive. So it would, in that sense, not be a museum. So, of course, in my practice, let's say the non-collecting institutions played a certain role, but one should not rule out the potential of the museum. So, but the social element that I was addressing was more if people have a chance to co-run the organization, so I was talking about Künstler House, and this was about, since 150 years, artists run their own association in the middle of Vienna, and they have a chance to be on the board, to influence the program, to be the president, to be the whatever, so all the positions are taken by artists, and that's the social element. This is a completely different relationship than a state-owned museum where every 10 or 15 years a new director is appointed by a minister, and that's it.
You mentioned earlier in your talk also the importance of critique and criticism. And you said, even in your positions in the PS1 experience, there's a lot of ears open to not just the artist's practice, but what was being said. Also micro-criticisms, but also published criticisms of what's happening. Can you speak a little bit about where those criticisms get generated and how important that is to the soil of creating kind of this a vibrant knowledge-producing institution of the now, that has the potential to span the next, to look forward into the future for 150 years and have roots within the culture.
Well, this spectrum ranges from the one artist who privately tells the museum curator, look, friend, I really think you do not have enough women on your list, to violent demonstrations, attacks, activity on the street, strikes, whatever you could imagine in a revolutionary situation. But that spectrum, from this, let's say, friendly critique of a colleague, I can assure you all of that is observed. All of that. This is really, this is something that people outside of institutions nearly always underestimate. How acutely people working in the spaces realize all the signals of dissent. All the signals, they read everything. The smallest tweet somewhere, they will know it. They will think about it. Again, there was this tweet. So I'm exaggerating, of course, but it's really from, agonistic practices. It's really from the revolutionary power on the street to the cooperative, friendly relationship, which can be a critical relationship, which changes institutions, but it does, or it can.
Sometimes transparency is the problem when that breaks down. So there's criticisms and then something happens when there's no transparency and then there's a divided group at some point. So let's move on to the hot topic of the day, probably, which is Manifesto. So you were involved in Manifesto 4 as a director, and you've had a chance to spend 8 hours, as you said, significant time visiting this. Do you have any immediate? Again, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but it's fun to.
Well,
do you have any immediate concern or critique? Now, there's enough to say there's works on display, there's local artists, there's representation, obviously, that's here, but is there anything that from your background and perspective that you think that's worth investigating?
Well, all of it, and of course I'm prepared for it, but at the same time, knowing that maybe the most outspoken critics of Manifesto are in the very room, So this will not be done within a 5 minutes conversation here. So all the critique of the big biennial was always the same. It comes from outside. It does not care about local realities. It has the potential of even destroying grown activities. It diverts political attention from other more needed things. There's even, at least in my machine translated observation of Albert's postings, there's even much more severe criticism where the criticism is even related to corruptive processes and so forth. That I cannot comment on, so that I just do not know about. But what I know is that for any manifesto, the most important part is not what manifesto did. It's more like, what did the people who were there before, what did they do with it, or against it, or for it, or with it? And what did those same people do after it? Because of it, or against it, or in spite of it, or motivated by it? So I can see that, let's say, except from individual voices, I have not come across the big letter of protest signed by 200 members of the Kosovo art scene against Manifesta, and I have looked for it. I would have seen it. Had it existed, I had seen it. And had it existed, then probably it would be different. Now, obviously, most of the people choose some kind of cooperative strategy. They were hired, many people had jobs. Obviously, a lot of people were able to participate as artists. I heard today for the first time that this was part of a quota requirement that was, being brought against it. And the interesting thing for me was everybody would say, oh, this is so great that this time Manifesta involved so many local artists. It's really an accomplishment, and it has never done before, and it's really special, and it's really, let's say, for the outside visitor, that seems like something really unique, something you missed at other places. But I tell you, if somebody had confronted us in Frankfurt with a requirement for local artists, we would have loudly protested and walked out of the city. Me, the curators, Manifesta Foundation, everybody said, look, no way we would have accepted the push. But of course, Frankfurt 2002 is a completely different situation than Pristina 2022. And that, having said that, I talked to Bala before, from the perspective of a, let's say, art tourist, I liked it. I liked it because it had some kind of integration of the city and the exhibition and the young and the old and the local and so this kind of, let's say, handcraft of doing an exhibition. That was well solved. You go into the Grand Hotel and you have this relationship to the city. But of course, knowing Summer School, knowing Albert, knowing a lot of other people, I know that, of course, hell, I have no idea what will happen with Brick Factory. Maybe we'll run through a 5-star hotel in 5 years. I don't know. I have no idea what will happen to the Grand Hotel, but I know one thing. It will not be defined by Manifesta. It will be defined by the people who live here, and you. Or hopefully. So it will not be defined by what's closing on October 31st. It will be defined by what's starting October 31st. And that's where it starts to become interesting. I have no idea, for example, if that situation at the Brick Factory is actually that open as it seems to be. I just know that if it's an open situation, that's the best moment. But it could disappear. I don't know. You will tell me.
Yeah.
And of course, the biggest criticism, and that I can only underline whenever things like Manifesta go into such a fragile, weak, financially weak environment, the amount invested. Of course, when we spent then 2.5 million in Frankfurt, that was not a big deal, for Frankfurt. But I'm fully aware that I don't know the funding here is
4.6 million.
Yeah, of course, the dimensions between regular, non-existing funding of a local art scene and the investment for such an international event, of course, puts the stakes enormously high. And whether or not this is even acceptable, I would not know. But as I said before, I did not have to go through a picket line in front of the Grand Hotel that told me, don't enter, don't go,
I'm going to open the floor to questions, but I have one more comment before we move on. Why is 1969 so damn cool? Like, really, there's the Vietnam War there, and what you listed, I don't see any innovation in activism since that time. It's like they're just working on the same things, but in a worse way.
That's really.
What is it about that? That's before the age of the internet. There was something just very cool about that moment, somewhere between 66 and 73. And it's like this magical space where authenticity occurred within it.
Well, I have just two speculations actually, not research, but speculation. One is, of course, it's of course better sometimes for activism if things have not yet happened. So of course now a lot of those things already happened. So you think you don't have to fight for it. But I think in a broader picture, I guess it must have to do with, I think the Vietnam War, which I was not able to present because there's a whole other interesting story about the anti-war poster that was actually produced by the Art Workers Coalition, and that is hardly being written about, which was originally a co-production between MoMA and the Art Workers Coalition. So the famous anti-war poster, this End Babies poster, was an official co-production between MoMA and the Art Workers Coalition. But only in the last minute, MoMA pulled out of the cooperation and said, okay, we cannot be affiliated with an official anti-war poster. But it was close to being official. And I think that the whole politicization of the Vietnam War created a space in which politics was unavoidable.
Questions? Comments?
First of all, I want to thank you, Martin, for this insightful presentation, and I really think highly about it, regardless to theoretical modesty with which you approached it. I want to go back to this Art Workers Coalition because it's very close to my heart. I translated it 20 years ago in Macedonian, exactly for the same reasons as you showed, this admiration of this kind of clarity of demands, because often with protests the clarity is lacking, and here it's all clear. But one thing that struck me now in the light of the presentation is exactly the lack of mentioning of something that you mentioned, the NDA agreements in the art world. I think this is one of the taboos that we don't
Which agreement?
Non-disclosure agreement
Okay.
that you probably, I'm just guessing, you signed for Manifesto in Cyprus.
Nicosia, right?
Yes, in Nicosia. And I also had the privilege to sign one such contract in my life. And I think that speaking of institutional critique and criticism in general, actually somehow force us to talk about this as well. This taboo when you are involved in some kind of big problem, conflict with the institutions, and something radically changed because of this conflict. In this case of Nicosia is the cancellation of Manifesto. In my case, it was even a bigger problem, but I really think that this is the way how institutions somehow silence the critical voices, because you are not allowed to speak loudly about whatever happened there. And this is not really an artistic project, it's exactly the opposite. Our institutions somehow avoid or protect themselves by trying to somehow cover up all these critical voices. This is only a comment, you don't have to answer, because I know how difficult it is to discuss these situations. From my point of view, I always say I cannot discuss more about this because you're not allowed. You sign a legal, agreement or document with which you're kind of obliged not to talk publicly about the conflicts that happened.
But, I mean, first I think, for example, you see it happened before, social media, basically. Now, that would not be possible today to have so little sources on such a big conflict. So, such a big conflict with so little public discussion, I think, would not happen again. Tate, for example, obviously now had an agreement with 3 artists who motioned because of discriminatory practices. Obviously, the agreement, how much they paid, is not public, but the whole controversy was public. So at least people know what they were fighting about. So they do not know whether or not they now receive £50,000 or £100,000, but
He said 6 digits.
yeah, 6 digits, yes, a 6 digits figure. So, of course, I agree, transparency is still an important thing. If you go to the website, for example, of Moderna Museum in Sweden, even in the colophone, it informs the visitors every correspondence with the museum is subject to public inspection. Every email going in or out of the museum, the members of the public can ask for it. And of course, people from the museum tell me that then you make more phone calls and you make more meetings. But at least, there's a country in Europe who has the law that any member of the public can go to the museum and say, please, I want the email correspondence of your director from January through June this year. So of course, you can have more or less transparency, and it's something which is worth fighting for. Surprisingly, in many of these transforming democracies, in former current Eastern Europe, the transparency requirements sometimes are even better than in the West. People tell me, for example, in comparison between Ukraine and Austria right now, it's easier to get certain information from public offices in Ukraine than in Austria, because they have higher transparency standards. But for Manifesta and Nicosia, one thing I can tell, you're right, I'm subject to that kind of non-disclosure for life, I'm not sure. But the important thing is, what I can say is the battlefield was when art left the arena of symbolic politics, and if it's real politics. So what you immediately learn is, if you start to be in real politics, you play it like in real politics, and then it's power play. It's not symbolic any longer. So you realize, so in very short, it was about, many years in the Turkish-occupied area of town. It's not that part is not so much a secret. So it was about wanting to use venues in the Turkish-occupied part of the city, and that, of course, is a major political issue and taboo then. Even though they made us feel like it would not be a problem. It's still being taken. This was off rock.
You want that?
So the difference the differences between real politics or symbolic politics, that's where it really starts to become where you need to know as an artistic person whether you're still in one field or already in the other.
Just a comment, I'm glad that you mentioned this, because my contribution towards the field of institutional critique was an exhibition that also invited Albert in, which was Inside Out. And this was exactly the addition to institutional critique, the real politics, the political system, which is often left out in the conversations about institutional critique, and especially in our region. Actually, this doesn't work,
Right.
unless you put in the context, institutional critique in the context of critical.
I'm going to just add a short comment to that. In that context, again, I don't purport to, I wasn't born here, but I spent 10 years of my life here, so I feel like take my chunk. The people, like for example, in a small place like Cosentino, somewhat isolated, maybe the scene is a few hundred people, but really the active scene is less than 100 people. And if 60 of them are engaged in something like Manifesta, it makes it almost impossible to discuss the political structure and who is left out and why. It's a very difficult problem, and I think it speaks to your comment where it doesn't work in this context. It's not the same as it would operate in Austria or in Germany, and there's a lot of very silent things that happen, or silent voices. So those things bubble beneath the surface. But what I can probably say to your comments is, well, let's see what happens as we move forward. It's not going to be what we think we're going to establish on October 31st.
Well, and I think that's what I'm actually interested in hearing from you. I mean, there is a certain, let's say, the outside visitor would think, so some of those things that we see here seem to deliver a promise. So, a promise of a new institution here, which is already basically opened, a promise of, not even fully defined, spectacular new area in the brick factory, we don't know, a promise of urban intervention, which could theoretically, maybe, one could come back in 5 years and take a bike and go through this green corridor and enjoy it, and then some people would say, do you remember, originally it was just yellow paint on the tracks for Manifesta, or nothing would happen, I know a parking lot in Vienna, which was used for artistic interventions, urbanistic interventions in the 70s by a group of local architects. It's still a parking lot, 50 years on. And now they start an architectural process to turn the parking lot into something else. So I just do not know. So I can just tell you that the visitor will not be able, from what they see, to assess whether or not the promise is like a fake ticket, or if it's going somewhere. That's up to a lot of people around you, and you, at least you yourself.
No, you're right. The visitor is not even expected to do anything about it, actually. But I expect the parliament will do something about it.
But if, let's say, if somebody would know that it's, let's say, a fake,
yes,
the brick factory, I don't know, is already sold, or that, I don't know, whatever could be the...
No, but I think the time is right now that this experience that Europe had with Manifesta comes to an end. Let's say that Pristina is the last Manifesta, actually, because I think that the mechanism as such has exploited itself more than it should. It should have ended at Nicosia, actually, because it showed that it cannot deliver what was created for initially. Why it's still lingering on? Damn, like hurt as a big animal and then crawling through the cities and still trying to find its way. I don't know, because no one actually attempted to stop it. And I think Pristina should be the end of it, because it's not that because it's foreign or because it's another neo-colonial presence here, because we are full of these structures. It's because it lied, actually, because when it came, it asked us if we wanted it, and we hadn't. It's not that we were just outside. So in the end, it served politicians and not the art scene. And don't expect that the art scene will write their museum, or even if they do, someone will just wipe it out, because the art scene was fighting for a museum against the Prime Minister and the Mayor. So, and the same Mayor, his office for culture, then applied for Manifesta, but the idea was completely different from what it is today. And I mean, the question is now, who asked for those quotas? I mean, if you know, because I saw the quotas when they issued public statements, right? They say 47% Kosovo art is included. And then for the first time, the position of the curator is raised. Right? So last edition of Manifest had 5, 6, 3, 4, 1. There's no curator in the structure. The curator is a curator, but in the structure manifesto that doesn't exist. They created, so basically they killed Harald Zeeman. You know, so they initiated a new name called mediators, right? They mediate something. So if Harald Zeeman would be alive, he would think that he did nothing, right? So that's why I think they have to end. And at some point in time, when so basically we had two meetings. One before they applied, and they said, if we come, would you be okay with it? And I said, yes, but we will try to use you.
Sorry, just for clarification, when you say us or you, do
Station.
you mean the scene or station?
No, Station. Basically, they came to meet us in Station with the director of culture because we were working together to protect the building so that it would become a museum and things like that. So together with the director, there was a board that came, the team, which was small.
You're talking about here, the building, and
I'm not sure talking about.
No. It's just it's not, and it's not about the boxing club. It's the next stage of the scene. It's about the Museum of Contemporary Art, which will be the next level of development of the independent scene. It's not about this building, because this building can be refurbished without Manifesta, it's nothing. But the idea was if Manifesta can serve something bigger, something that it never did before, actually. Not to develop a new oral history in Kosovo, because Kosovo has institutions that deal with oral history, with stories, and with everything. This is nothing. It's just trying to spend the budget somewhere else because they know that they will be audited in the end. And if you go around, you see the budget is still there. They're not only spending for 5 years the budget on this new oral history in Kosovo, but I learned from Susanna they will establish a new institution also in Skopje with our money. Exhibition institution, whatever, which will be long term also. So there's a lot of things that show that this thing is just, it has to come to an end. What I want to say is just basically who demanded the quota, who asked for the quota. If you know, because I saw the percentage, but I didn't know that someone actually asked them to have a quota.
I have no inside information on Manifesto in Pristina at all, and that's completely true. So whatever you say, you know it more from sources.
It's not from what was lingering on the public sphere.
It's really like, because I ended, my tenure at the board ended in 2007,
Yes.
and I'm really not privy
No,
to
but
inside.
you said, and then I just wrote it down. But also just to explain what a picket line is, because in this context, people don't know what a picket line is. And Esther Leslie also mentioned the picket line, and I told her later you should have explained. The picket line is basically a group of people who block the entry into the building which is under strike. So workers of that institution, they create a fence, a human shield in front of the institution, and they block the entrance, and no one can enter. That's a picket line. So I would not expect that the Kosovo art scene, the young Kosovo art scene, would create a picket line. I would expect, former members of Vetlendosi to create a picket line, but the problem is that Vetlendosi is supporting this I call it corrupt mechanism.
Don't you think that it looks the way it looks because they knew that if they would not do it like that, with the high amount of local artists and whatever, they would exactly get those letters and demands like part of the ones we saw. They would get a scene that says, look, you cannot do that, you cannot do this. So don't you think it's some kind of preemptive reaction to a criticism that was expected?
They are a wounded animal, and they are afraid all the time. This is the problem, because if they would be brave and bold and knew what they wanted to do, and we told them what they need to do, so they knew what they need to do. It was very clear, because initially the mayor had the idea to push the art scene on the other side of the railroad tracks, not in the center of the city. And I told them, you're just pushing art outside.
By the museum?
Yes, it was the request of the former mayor. The art is up there. Here we do a concert hall, we sing, whatever. And then when this seemed very difficult to digest, then they said the Grand Hotel, because the Grand Hotel was not the venue at all. it was always the brick factory, which, there's barely any intervention in the brick factory, and they had money to do intervention there. But basically, the problem is that they are not brave enough anymore. This animal is wounded, and this is the time to say thank you for what you did, let's say in 60s, 70s, whenever. But this, what they are doing now, it's difficult to digest, because in the end of the day, it's not only about the money.
What do you think? I'm sorry. That because what I thought that I could.
But we have the responsibility to say to Barcelona, tomorrow to Kiev or whatever, this is the experience, and it's not that it's foreign or anything. It is not what they say, because they cannot stand ground to their positions. This is the problem.
But I'm not sure if one can, just make that separate those issues. But at least in the context of what I was presenting, I thought that now two things could be of interest. Like, are you part, is somebody part of a real, let's say, fantasy process about the brick factory? That was one thing that I was interested in. Like, is there some kind of space where people would say, pool, library, museum, non-collective museum, blah, blah, blah. So because that at least would be an interesting process. It's always, for me at least, the most thrilling moment in institutions' histories before you find out what they are. And the other side is, where does this, let's say, concept of Institute for Narrative Practices come from? Because this one is not finished at all, like it's completely new starting, and this one seems to be completely finished. And that's for me the interesting juxtaposition. So you have one basically ready to go, and the other, I don't know, maybe 5, 10 years, maybe.
Ready to go where?
I asked all of you.
Yes, ready to go, equipped with funding for the next 5 years, but ready to go where? Because where do you go with such a structure? Where do you go? What it is, first of all. The problem is not...
But is somebody happy about it? That's what I'm interested in, because over there's an empty, typical...
Meeting. They create nothing actually by one there.
No,
It's just meeting, like putting something for meeting. It's like more just to sit and to talk rather than, or at least what I see. If we talk for fracturing, it was just public, it's like park. I don't know, like with Taubasha is kind of same, if they put some fancy and stuff like that there, you even cannot enter into the fracture as much as I see. It was full empty, nothing, because I go in wrong direction, so therefore, but I don't see anything there, even program or something that they are
But
doing.
is it part of the, let's say, cultural development policy discourse of Pristina?
It was an idea of the former mayor, which is... the problem is the necessity for the brick factory was not coming from the grassroots, let's call it like that. It was an idea of the mayor, to try to create let's say, a diversion, right? Because there's a building in the center of the city, close to the Yes, the Gremia building, which is thought to be an ex-museum contemporary, let's say. And even the current mayor says that that's too small, because I also had a meeting with the current mayor and said that's wrong, we can create this very easily, it's quite easily done. He said it's too small. I said it's okay, you can create in your next term a bigger one, but this is here, it's almost ready. The municipality bought the building to demolish it. This is the problem. But now, because the municipality bought the building, the potential is still there, right? And discussions have to happen. And they have to abandon this idea of the brick factory, 3 hectares of land, and to do, this story. Because the needs are immediate. What Manifesta did not do, and I think this story with this new donor-driven institution created there is that it signaled a possible change in policy. And to explain, for instance, if they say this structure of people will have support for the next 5 years. Tomorrow we will go to the municipality and say, we need support for the next 5 years. And the problem is that Manifesta didn't deliver policy change which we wanted. Because if there would be a policy change after Pristina was announced as a winner, it would mean that support for contemporary art would be different, not just increase, but different. There would be studios for artists to develop their practice so that they are not included as quota later. Because these artists are not included for their work, they're included as quota. This is the problem, because no one invested in their work.
But they also included, that's what interests me, they also included because the current.
If they know that they are included,
No,
because of the quota, that's horrible.
but just so that I'm quoted correctly.
No,
I heard,
I said this public, don't worry.
I heard about the quota just a half an hour ago for the first time in my life. But before I heard about it, I acknowledge it as a clever contemporary curatorial strategy because other than 5 or 10 years ago, there's a new, let's say, a new appreciation of the local artist. So let's say that the clever curator now has an easier time strategically to invite local artists than 10 years ago. Because 10 years ago one would say, it's not international, it's not. But now localness is a stronger value and a stronger currency. So for me it's not only because of quotas or non-quotas, it's also about how your curatorial priorities change,
Yes, but there's no curator, you forget. There's no curator. So someone said quota, include them all. This is the problem, democratization. Yeah, include them all, and it doesn't really matter. But just the problem is that in this way, the majority of exhibitions by the National Gallery are done in the same way. This is the problem, so there's no change. Because with some, let's say, there was a different approach when one director was there for 3 years, then international curators were hired, and there was no public call. Part of the exhibition realized through public call, part of the exhibition curated. And always, Kosovo artists public call, because there's no investment in the practice, the rest, because they found the model. It's not that they invented it. It was here already. So if you would go to the National Gallery, you'd see this is the practice. So how to increase, to say, we took 4.6 million euros, but we invested in our artists, 47%. So it was just merely to find a justification for the amount of funding that they were using. They also employed a lot of people, much more than we needed. Yes, they're saying the same thing, but I'm being very clear. This is to be very clear. They post an image of the amount of people that they employed initially, there were 6, 7, and then they post another image of the amount of people, how the team increased. But it's the same biannual. It's not that they progressively employ. So there's a lot of things, but I'm just concerned, and I think we have the responsibility to say, okay, this is what happened to our friends internationally. If it would be like a demand or something, for me, just like to share the information, right? So that this stops at some point in time, because I don't think that it serves any purpose, actually, right? I think more quality in art was done by a Muslim Umici annual exhibition curated by, let's say, Charles Escher, than this exhibition, actually. So it's in that level.
I just want to go a little bit backwards in history of Manifesto. I'm not sure whether everybody knows here how Manifesto and why, and you should, I guess you know better, was actually how it emerged. It emerged immediately after the fall of the wall. It was, in fact, as a kind of response to this enthusiastic belief that now there is no wall anymore between East and West. I attended not the first but the second manifesto which took place in Luxembourg, and in the introduction by Robert Fleck, that I often use it for my lectures as a kind of example of this wishful organization of art, can I say this, where he promised, in a way, he thought about a manifesto. He was one of the 3 curators, that a manifesto will become this kind of instrument of somehow easing up, lessening this distinction between East and West. And this is why the early manifestos were always interested in not building up new institutions, but somehow going to abandoned spaces, supporting this renovation for art. And so I guess that this is what Albert thought when he said that now it's enough. Because this promise somehow, I'm not saying that I agree completely, but I understand where it comes from. But this promise of manifesto is really still kind of resonating with this time, political time. But it's a long time ago. So many things changed on the political and art and cultural map in Europe that I agree that the model somehow exhausted itself. I'm not sure that it should extinguish.
I would just suggest to also, in the case of Manifesta, not only think about it as a solid block who can either be used for the good and then unfortunately does not deliver and it just delivers the bad, but about something that actually is just one of the actors of many. And then there's a before manifesto and after manifesto, and my experience is, at least in developments of cities, in development of cultural scenes, these moments always can go both ways. So you can, really have a situation where in October 200 people stand up and say, look, and now it's over, or maybe in January, and they would say, look, we thought there was a promise, but not to manifesto. So they're not addressing Hedwig in Amsterdam, but they're addressing their local policy, where political fights are supposed to happen. It's possible that 200 people walk up there and say, look, you were able to spend for about 5 million on Manifesta, and now we really want to see more for us for the next 5 years. It's possible. But it's also possible that people say individually, great, my job at Manifesta probably helped me get a job in Brussels at an institution, and then I'm just away. I'm not a part of the scene any longer. Maybe that's good, maybe that's bad, I don't know. So the potential is always there for it to turn either way, because once that money is gone, usually this is money which is just around for some time, and then it's, I don't know, the political games move very fast. So meaning the money for next year or for 2025, it's a completely different story. But what I'm just saying is the activities of the local scene as a political voice are not fully dependent on whether or not Manifesto does that or exhibits that or does that. It's just, in half a year, they're somewhere else, but many people are here. And they will define the budget for 2024, and they will define the budget for 2025, whether or not they're silent or whether they're loud. And I at least would say usually you get more when the scene is loud. That's...
Yes, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they have to be 200 people. Because this is a small scene.
Yeah,
It's not that there are not 60 or 100 or something, but there's also in many cases, it's also about a vision. Someone can project a vision. Not everyone maybe understands at some point. Someone sees it happening, right? And I saw it happening. And it will happen. If Manifesto will not be a vehicle, something else will be the vehicle. And it's not that we are not working on alternatives all the time. But the problem is also our responsibility, because at the end of the day, this is taxpayers' money. And if I know that this funding was not used as it was intended to use, I have a responsibility to say someone should audit this operation. And if this operation turns to be something else than what was originally meant for, right, I think it should end. It But then, because right now there are two other projects we developed a design, and if we remain silent, and we know what happens here, I think we will be responsible for what happens next. And this is my concern.
There are things underneath the surface. Any other thoughts or questions, comments?
I just wanted to know what do you think about press or media's play in all of this institutional critique, because we have been seeing here that actually media has never published any critique. It has, but it was, should I say, very badly done, or not to the point. I'm talking about Manifesta, and it has censored a lot of different critique that has been happening on social media.
Well, I mean, of course, we have to distinguish pre-social media and now. So now, of course, theoretically, it's not as important any longer what the media says, because people can be their own media. But of course, if nobody joins, if there is a fight, if there is a legitimate fight, and again, I'm not inside of any Manifesta story in Krishna, so I can also not really assess whether there's reason for a real fight or not. I can just observe that I don't hear too much, Media, of course, if you have no friends at all and nobody multiplying your message or your concern, then it's always more difficult to have a political impact. That's clearly you have to be more resourceful, more creative to develop your own media strategies to make things known. But I just, I recommend to be specific. So, criticism usually becomes unavoidable the more specific it is in political terms. So, for example, if in political terms people always say, oh, that's a waste of money, nobody moves. But as it happened in Austria when, I don't know, it became known that a certain museum director, used museum's money for the birthday party of his mother, that was specific. Then it turned into a different discussion. Then it was not just general talk about using public money or not, but then it was like, okay, this is the issue. So specificity also helps a little bit in media relation, because there's the strategy of activists saying you put your little news on inside a website, but at one point it becomes unavoidable. At one point it's so specific, bigger media cannot not talk about it, because rumors start talking. But in general, I want to go back to my original point in a way, because I'm not able to assess whether it's what's needed here in terms of strategy. I just want to reiterate that those institutions you can influence them still. So it's not only about the question media or not media, it's also about, okay, who is in there, who is in this, who writes the letter, who when you said Art Workers Coalition's demands are very clear, that was also because this went through a process of months of public meetings. So this was not 3 people in a back room writing concise demands. This was a public process. Of course, New York being a city of 80 million people, these are small groups, so 80 people at an Art Workers Coalition meeting would probably be 15 people in Pristina. But I heard about the old network, I heard about the new pact, I heard about around Corona. So it seems as if there are group relations and spaces and networks where those, where one could say, look, these are the 30 most important demands, or 20 or 15 of the current independence in Kosovo. That seems to be possible for me, at least on a political level. But I have not read it. So it's obviously either in development, or somebody needs to start, or there's no consensus. I don't know. So this is what I hope a little bit from the evening to say. The interesting moment is when 20 people meet in a room with a white sheet of paper and say, what are our 20 demands? Or what are our 20 ideas for this building or for this structure? That's the interesting moment, and that's the moment to use. And that's the moment where, surprisingly, sometimes something works, you know? Sometimes it makes a difference whether or not one group champions a museum and another group champions a dance hall and the fourth group champions a pool. In Vienna, Museumsquartier, the leading social democratic party of the 1980s, governing the city of Vienna since 70 years, one of the leading people told publicly that a shopping center is the best idea for Museumsquartier. This was theoretically an option. So theoretically there could be a shopping center, but there is Museumsquartier. So you never know where you are in that moment, and I don't know. I hope for all of you that I will come back maybe in 10 years and we'll walk through some nice cultural contemporary art center with good governance and good representation of the local scene and transparent operation and equally balanced gender justice programming, and we will. But maybe we'll walk through a shopping center. I don't know.
There's one aspect to
It's
this.
an annual budget, 4.6 million.
Yeah, why not? That's like Mumbai in Vienna has about 10 million, so yes, 4 million, 2 million, whatever, yeah. Great.
There's one aspect to the comment that comes up in lectures like these, but here is there's no school of art, there's no faculty of art history at the University of Pristina. There's no place where there's like critical dialogue that can be produced and published. So in some sense, it's like looking around and finding the capacity and finding that's why I'm critical of, you're going to build a center for narrative practice, are you? When we can't even criticize internally, I'm saying we as if I'm from here, you can't criticize internally with the proper education to be able to articulate why it is it's a problem, even though you're sensing it as a problem, because you don't have the historical training to do so, in some sense. Now, there are others that, there are a few that have that capacity, many of which are working for Manifesto. They've got their education from the outside, they're working for the behemoth, and whether that, my point of criticism is more like the point before I made, it's so essential to the process. It's so essential to getting something of real rich value to be able to address, and it's also boring without the criticism. And you just kind of walk around like, oh, let's cheerlead this. And it's not that you don't enjoy it, like you said, you enjoy it in some sense. It's not that you don't enjoy it, but there's something missing if you want to be an active, engaged professional in the arts in your youth from the area. So in a way, the summer school is the only place that I've known in 10 years that has critical dialogue that really stand up internationally in some sense, that is pushing for the education process to allow for critical voices to emerge, to strengthen the scene of the country, of the region, wherever you are.
I'm not in a position to advise on so individual strategies, but I know, for example, from having worked with cultural initiatives in rural Austria, that I said if I should make a rough distinction between two, if I had to separate them in two camps, I would say one maintain their sense of opposition and underground and alternative and whatever, even on a fragile basis all their life. And the others, the people who run them become vice mayors. So you always have this kind of two groups in an art scene, roughly speaking. One with the potential to, connect with the forces that be, and then, you find them as directors of new centers, or as new ministers, or as advisors to ministers, or you find them as people at least writing concepts and whatever, and you find others who just where the let's say, permanent opposition suits them better. But it's not up to me to advise who wants to be on which side of those options. But that seems to me one of the strategic dilemmas of a place like Station.
I mean, just to say, because our position is, let's say we are not involved, but somehow involved. Let's say, but there are other organizations who were involved, and they are very critical right now. And this is an ongoing process is happening. And by chance, and I'm organizing the last conference of the program this year. By chance, I learned that one of the organizations, in some meeting with Manifesta, they read a letter and they listed their demands. Let's say in this letter, let's say. I still don't know the demands. The institution didn't welcome them at all, even though they were a partner organization. You know, so there is now an ongoing discussion among this partner organization. We will go there tomorrow to see, and it's a public meeting. The conference in the end will be like a public hearing, let's say, of voices of what will the process be. But you are right in many ways that in the end of the day, you have to have a process somehow. You have to have official demands, and we were discussing, whether we will react as an institution or not. The networks have changed because power is very instrumental. It's difficult to maintain networks which are not bound by funds and by just by ideas, and then they depend on continuous support, and it's very difficult to confront with power, which is very direct. It controls the media are part of the ideological state apparatus or whatever. So it's and we have experience in this context, so we know how this works in many ways. Strategies are very important. How you address this issue. We have used maybe 1% of opposition. I just write sometimes, right? So we didn't use all the mechanisms and tools at hand to confront what is going on. There's a lot going on in the background, which still would be formulated at some point in time. But somehow I see the end, which should come as an advice to everyone, just to stay away. Because this mechanism has done 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It has even, how you say, ruined the trust of partner organizations that were part of it officially.
Yeah.
And this is we are critical why there are those organizations involved and not so many others. So there's another level. But even if these, and they feel being used, which is another problem. But I just wanted to tell you that, of course, you are very careful what you say, and I respect that, but it is noted. And we know how these processes work, even in this context, because we work for quite some time. But I still hope and I expect that the art scene will not always behave like there's a saying in Serbian: when you cannot beat them, just join them.
It's not only in Serbia.
This was the strategy that was adapted. They felt they couldn't beat them, they just joined them. Some of them, but I disagree with Daniel that says there's some critical potential in working for Manifesta right now. I completely disagree. I don't think that there's any potential there. I think they just employed as many as they could so that they would just take people. Because Manifesta is completely run by the outside. Let's say there's very few, let's say, decisions made by the local. So it's completely, they are just kept there for other reasons, but not actually, not used as a capacity. And that's some sense of reality that I have.
I can just say that different than in maybe times like the hard repression, those demands, those groups, those networks, they will have those letters, those post-manifesto movements will also find their echo in part of the international art world who now observed it. So if there were so many, let's say, disappointed actors next spring, and of course, when I met people in February as part of this research, some said, okay, we're just going to wait until the manifesto is over. We all don't know what's exactly the situation. So it also seemed a little bit like we could call it some kind of truce, like you wait, you say, okay, we don't shoot now, but we reserve the right to shoot later. So it's in a way you have that feeling. And so I can just, I'll stick to a few things that I always say, not to let's say, so that I have to rethink everything once again. It's like, don't underestimate that criticism is actually, can be successful if you keep in mind that it's not this fortress, not always this fortress-like situation. If it is a fortress-like situation, you need to, you need the hard tools anyway. But if it's not, and that's what I observed a lot of times, it's more fluid than one thinks because things are moving. And at least you will disagree, but other people say it seems to be more fluid now in terms of the feedback mechanisms between official cultural policy and the independent scene. So
it's one person.
What?
It's one person.
No, I talked to more than one person, so I have more info.
Yeah.
Like,
We also talk to more than one person,
Yeah.
one person design.
no, but it seems not like, didn't even you say that in terms of the background of people, there's more overlap between the scenes in terms of political, cultural policy scenes and independent scenes than before. That's the way I understood it.
It's been a lovely talk, I think, unless there's any final comments.